Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Wednesday video. Now, some of you may already know where we're going, and to be honest, you probably hopefully read the title of the video already. So, yeah. Anyway, we've already talked a bit about the US logistics forces, initially base force, then service force, as they've gone from the sort of their foundation through to the end of 1942, and the Guadalcanal campaign's wrapping up. And plenty of you are in the comments for saying, I hope you continue to talk about this, what the US forces did once they actually got their act together logistically. And a few of you said, this sounds like something Sal would want to know about. Shockingly, it was. So, just in case people don't know, perhaps our guest would like to introduce himself.
Well, I appreciate that, Jack. I'm Sal Mercogliano. I am the host of What's Going On with Shipping over on YouTube. I'm a maritime historian, former merchant mariner, and I sailed for the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command, an entity that does naval logistics. So I did it both afloat and ashore for them, and that's kind of my field of research is Navy logistics.
So, shockingly, Sal knows an awful lot about this subject. So, who better to take us through the latter stages of World War II as the US Navy's logistics train truly gets rolling? So I guess we'll start off with the first question. How does the surface force or service force plan to move from being primarily base building? Because at this stage, of late 42, early 43, they've done some refueling of carrier groups at sea, but a lot of their efforts have been focused on things like Noumea and Espiritu Santo, and the ships have come to them rather than them going out to the ships. So how are they moving from that to still doing that as more places are captured, but they're also now having to undertake far more resupply at sea because you're getting really big fleets moving on into properly offensive roles?
Well, I think you mentioned that. There was an early operation done in 1942 at Bora Bora in Tahiti, and that was Bobcat. And one of the things that they did was how to set up a fuel farm there. This is a point about midway between Hawaii and Australia. It was also key from coming from the West Coast to and the Panama Canal to Australia. And initially, they were going to set up a big fuel farm there. And that was going to be the midway refueling point heading to Australia. But in the interim, they had to get fuel there. So what they did is they took one of their older oilers. They had two of them, the Sepagula and the Ramapo, and they would kind of tag team them in there to provide fuel while they built the tanks. And it took a while to build the tanks. They realized that building permanent infrastructure ashore takes time. And we saw that the same thing with the development of Noumea, for example, at Afate, at Espiritu Santo, over at Tonga. It took a long time to build those structures. Now, you needed them ashore because you did need some reserve. However, I think one of the things that came out of that development was the idea is we can build permanent structures, but we can also establish these floating structures. And I think that was really the key point where they realized that as they go forward, as they grab Majuro and then Ulithi and move across the Pacific, they can use a floating prepositioning to basically get them in. So when they went to Majuro, for example, in 43 and 44 up into the Marshalls, they brought forward what they called station tankers. These were kind of older tankers, but more importantly, barges. They were building at Pearl Harbor and a batch of the Navy yards lighters, these kind of open barges and fueling barges. And so they were able to bring them up into these anchorages and station them there. And then what they could do is bypass Pearl Harbor, still fill up the fuel farm at Pearl Harbor. Remember, this is when they were building Red Hill. They were transitioning from the big fuel tanks that were above ground, that they had the 4.5 million barrels of fuel. And then they're building below ground another 6 million barrels of fuel. And what they were able to do was keep those plussed up, but then move across and go to Inuitak, go to Majuro, use those fuel farms there and not have to build the tanks ashore. They would just have the tankers there. So they developed a very kind of interesting, almost symphony of movement across the Pacific. You're using Warshipping Administration. These are commercial tankers. These are tankers that are being chartered by Admiral Emory S. Land, the head of the U.S. Maritime Commission, also the head of the Warshipping Administration. He's bringing commercial tankers out to these forward areas. They're going to meet with the oilers coming from, be it the Third Fleet, Fifth Fleet, or Seventh Fleet, refuel them, and then shuttle them ashore. But there is still a need. I mean, one of the things you do need at all these island bases is airfields. So those have to be developed. You do need some storage spaces ashore for some dry stores, but you're going to use a lot more of a mix of floating and kind of stationary floating objects to really develop it. And I think Bora Bora Bobcat becomes that model they follow. And you see that in Noumea and as they advance across the Pacific.
Oh, right. So obviously, you mentioned, you've got lighters, you've got old tankers, you've got charter tankers, you've got the fast fleet oilers, mostly sticking with the fleet itself. So, as they're really starting to balloon service force at this point, what ship types are the most needed, and which ones do they think actually we've got a pretty decent supply of these, either right now or coming down the slipways?
Yeah, I mean, you know as well as I do. You look at what Ed Miller wrote in War Plan Orange and what the U.S. was planning in War Plan Orange is they realized they needed just tons of hulls. They just knew they needed a variety of store ships, ammunition ships, oilers, you name it. And fortunately for the United States, before World War II starts, they started a massive commercial shipbuilding program. This is under the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. And their plan was to build 500 ships across 10 years, so 50 ships a year. And so they were building a large merchant fleet. Now they'd done this in World War One. Now the difference in World War One was they had a building program then, but it started very late. And more importantly, they allowed the shipyards to build to their own individual design. The 1936 plan was much different. They were building the standardized designs. So you had, for example, C2 and C3 cargo ships. These were kind of the model, five-hold cargo ships. The C3 was basically an enlarged C2 with additional berthing accommodations. A lot of them became attack transports during the war. You had the T2 tankers, the T3 tankers, and those ships were built under the U.S. Maritime Commission with the prospect that they can be converted very easily into auxiliary vessels. And if you look at the first 50 ships that came off the way, for example, 37 of the 50 were converted into auxiliaries. So when you look at the C2s, for example, a lot of them became store ships. They became ammunition ships. They became dry cargo ships. They became literally tenders, a whole batch of destroyer tenders, submarine tenders. Basically, the U.S. Navy had the access to a kind of pre-cut, pre-made auxiliary vessel that wasn't perfect. It didn't have everything you'd want. You would always want to build these ships probably from the keel up. But in terms of rapidly expanding, you had them. They were still building general purpose vessels, specific purpose vessels for them. But now they can actually modify vessels very easily. This is where, for example, they got the 12 T3 tankers, the fast oilers that came in, 4 of which get converted over to the Sangamon escort carriers. They're building T2 tankers. They also, for example, will even use Liberty ships and Victory ships. Liberty ships will become general cargo, what are called the Crater class, for just moving cargo around the Pacific for them. They'll build a smaller version, the FS class. This is the very famous ship that was in Mr. Roberts, kind of a smaller little freighter moving around. And then you have the Victory ships, which are going to be used as both cargo ships. They're going to be used as ammunition ships. They're kind of thrown into the role of ammunition ship late in the war and sent to Okinawa and Leyte. And then they're also going to be used as attack transports. So the Navy is very fortunate that they have these auxiliary ships already being built. All they're going to need to do is take delivery of them, bring them to a shipyard, and modify them for what they need. And so they identify the need. I need so many store ships, so many tenders, so many dry cargo, so many refrigerated ships, and they can mass produce them. As you mentioned in your first video, I mean, we only had 2 ammunition ships. We're going to need more, and that is where you see those ships come from.
Right. I suppose that makes it much easier from the planning stages as well, because if you've got standardized plans for, say, a C2 or C3, and you're told, well, we need a new set of submarine tenders or something like that, you don't have to go, well, how exactly are we going to do that? You just get the standard plans. You go, well, that space, that space, that space. Oh, we can't fit that there, but maybe we'll put some torpedoes over here. And you know what the layout is roughly going to be and how much room you've got without actually having to see the particular ship in question. And if something happens to that ship, it gets delayed or something, you in theory can just go, oh well, what a tragedy, there's another identical ship coming down the slipway 2 states over, we'll use that one instead. So
And it's a great commonality of design too. So in terms of parts, machinery, training, I mean, it really creates an almost seamless transition over with the steam plants they were using, with the steam turbines they were using. So it became just a natural one. And if you look at what makes up the service fleet, for example, it's populated by a lot of these Maritime Commission hull designs.
I know towards the end of the war, when the British Pacific Fleet is kind of learning all these lessons as a bit of a crash course, one of the things that causes great rejoicing is when a large force of victory ships get assigned to the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, because at that point they're sitting there going, well, we have a fleet train. There's almost no two identical ships in it, which is leading to all sorts of maintenance nightmares just to keep the fleet train going, let alone everybody else. And then they're told, oh, by the way, you're getting 20 identical ships. You can almost hear the cries of rejoicing from across the Pacific. Um, but another aspect, which we covered earlier, was mobile dry docks. So you've only got AFD1 starting off. But now, as we get into 43 and 44, you're getting the big mobile dry docks. You get some of those lovely photos of, an entire Iowa afloat in an atoll somewhere. Um, how much of a difference do those big floating dry docks make in both size and numbers? And are there any additional specialist ships they need to develop to support the dry docks?
Well, I mean, the need for dry docks just manifests itself. I mean, if you look at the Guadalcanal campaign, you can see that almost immediately. I mean, you go from Savo Island, where you lose four cruisers, two of which could have potentially have been saved had you had some sort of immediate repair facility there. And then you go to Tassafaronga, where, you have three cruisers, Pensacola, Minneapolis, New Orleans, heavily damaged. They undergo emergency repair at Tulagi, just enough to get out of there. And then they head to Sydney for the dry dock there, or down to Noumea, and then eventually over to Pearl and over to, I think it's Mare Island is where they wind up going. And, it becomes critically clear that we need more of this dry dock capacity closer forward. And so the Navy begins developing this concept of basically modular dry docks. So you have the kind of the medium and small dry docks that are independent units on themselves. They're propelled. You can bring them in. You can put a destroyer, maybe a light cruiser in them, submarines in them. But then you have the modular ones, and these are kind of the Lego blocks. You stick them together. You can build as big a dry dock as you want. You marry them together, sink them down, and you can use them. So obviously, there's a couple of features you needed. Dry docks by themselves obviously need to be in deep enough water where they can submerge down. You need anchoring vessels with them. So there's a little bit of support vessels. You need tugs. And more importantly, you need a lot of engineers for how to do this. I mean, in particularly, what you don't want to happen is what happens, for example, to Valiant in 44 when she falls out of the dry dock, basically falls off her blocks in the dry dock, or happened to Stewart when she was in the Dutch East Indies in 1942. You can damage a vessel and take it out of service completely. So you need all those prefabricated blocks. You need the engineers there. And what we see is the development really of Service Squadron 10. When Service Squadron 10 comes up, this idea of moving these repair facilities up forward, and you can bring these dry docks with you so that you can go from Noumea up to Guadalcanal, up to Majuro, to Ulithi, and start doing extensive repairs on site. You also have the advent of more repair ships, the Hector, the Ajax. These are the big purpose-built repair ships that are not converted. These are ships built from the keel up, but they contain all the machinery shops, all the prefabrication material, so that you can effect repairs in a forward area. So, for example, when you have an aircraft carrier like Randolph, which gets hit by a kamikaze at Ulithi, one of those long one-way kamikaze trip, they're all one-way, but this is a really long,
Yeah.
long range attack. And, Randolph takes that hit in the stern. Normally, that would require leaving the area, going back home, but now you can bring a repair ship right alongside, effect repair almost immediately, and do it. And I think, Drac, the big thing that people are forgetting is distance here. The distances involved to bring repaired vessels back to the west coast of the United States was traumatic. If you look at Houston takes our torpedo hit off the coast of Formosa. She's got to go 1,200 miles to Ulithi. I mean, 1,200 miles is, at 5 or 3 knots, whatever they can do, is going to take you a week. It's going to take you a week there. Then you got to get another 1,500 miles to Pearl, and then another 1,000 miles to get to the East Coast. So these dry docks up forward are absolutely essential. If you look at modern day, you'll see those heavy lift ships, the ships that are used to put a destroyer on the back, whether it's Cole in Aden, or if it's the Fitzgerald or the McCain. Those are kind of mobile dry docks. That's what you see currently being used. That's what you had back here. And so the specialization was really important about it. And we see them pay off extremely well when Washington, and I think it's Indiana, have their collision. They're
Mm.
able to dry dock them fairly quickly. And the damage that is done to the vessels with Houston and Canberra, for example, they're immediately able to get into dry docks and effect repairs. Pittsburgh is another one when she loses her bow in the hurricane. So you can move that up forward. And more importantly, too, I would argue not just the normal repairs, but also the dry docking that needs to be done periodically for just servicing. You're accumulating growth on the hull. You're having brand new hull ship designs coming out there that are experiencing problems. It's not unusual within the first year to require a dry dock of a vessel to ensure that everything is working correctly. So they're doing normal maintenance up forward. This is preventing you from taking a Cleveland class cruiser and having to sail it all the way back to the West Coast, or maybe the East Coast if the West Coast yards are too busy doing repairs and modernizations. So I mean, it's just a massive force multiplier for the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, to put it in context for some people, when before all of this, when Wasp and North Carolina are torpedoed, you of course have the destroyer, and I'm never quite sure how it's pronounced because whether it's O'Brien or O'Brien.
I think it's
Um,
O'Brien.
O'Brien. So she gets torpedoed, and by some miracle, she's a little destroyer been hit by okay, fair enough, the submarine version of a Long Lance, but that's still not exactly good news. But she's still afloat. But then, unfortunately, despite heroic effort, she founders several days afterwards on her way back to Pearl. And that kind of illustrates the dangers of you might survive the first encounter, but if the nearest place that can fix you is a week or two, several thousand miles away, it could still be at the end of you. Whereas if you've got a dry dock, relatively speaking, right on your doorstep, even if it can't completely repair you, it can at least patch you up and keep you afloat long enough for you to get back. And lesser damage, as you said, you can just basically repair, put the ship straight back into service.
Well, I mean, you're exactly right because O'Brien breaks her back, and
Mm.
much like Juno does. Also, if you had dry dock facilities, you could at least do the repairs necessary to keep them together. I mean, I'm not sure Juno makes it back from Nomia, whether she gets
Mm.
torpedoed or not by I-26, because her damage is so severe. I mean, they're worried about the ship buckling and just coming apart. And again, that allows you to retain those vessels much longer. And so the idea of pushing this forward, and it's always an interesting debate, is how far forward do you want to be? The Pacific is, just because of its vast nature, you can move up into Majuro and Ulithi and Guam and eventually Leyte and Manila Bay and establish these facilities, Subic Bay in particularly, and establish them and still be, close to range, but operating fairly safely in the area and have an extensive force. Service Squadron 10 is just an amazing force. When you look at the service squadrons by the end of the war,
Mm.
I think it's 3,000 ships, about 500,000 sailors are just doing the service forces, and not all the squadrons across. It's really an amazing undertaking.
Yeah, I mean, when you compare some of the shots of Ulithi, I mean, obviously there's Murderer's Row, everyone looks at that one, but you look at some of the wider shots in 44, 45, and you're thinking, just in this one shot, there are more service force ships than there were total in the service force in 1942. It's a huge expansion, but when they're on
I,
this kind of big ramp up, particularly in 43, are there any particular lessons that stand out to you as sort of the service force going, well, we're learning, but this is something we really need to learn and understand and sort of take forward?
Yeah, I think there's kind of the tactical application of the service forces, and so I think the service forces are learning a couple of things. One of the big force multipliers late in the war is the ability to transport ammunition. That was always the big one. That was the one that you had to come back in and resupply all the time. And the service force will learn how to do basically palletized loads of cargo over to warships underway. And that's going to be the big one. They were doing that to a lesser extent with aircraft carriers, but then they just start doing it with cruisers and battleships in particularly, where you can do it. I mean, this is always the big argument. You know, get to Iwo Jima and it's like, well, we want 10 days of bombardment. Well, you're never getting 10 days. I mean, because you can't load 10 days worth of ammunition on a ship. But one of the realizations is, well, if we can resupply the ships and not burn the barrels out, then maybe we can do a prolonger argument. And I would argue the biggest development is in underway replenishment to do that. So one of my bugaboos, and I talk about this a lot, is that Samuel Eliot Morison, the guy who writes the history for the U.S. Navy, that basically the first, 20 years was the standard source everybody looked at, understood logistics from the end of the war, but not the beginning of the war. If you were looking at underway replenishment early in the war, for example, it's a different beast. I mean, even just refueling a ship at sea was much different. If you look at the very first raids, if you look at Fletcher with Saratoga going to Wake, or the very first ones, they're refueling in a much different way than they do later in the war. One of the big directives is Nimitz will issue in August of 1942 a new directive on how to do underway replenishments, and it fundamentally changes the old previous way. Give you an idea. When you had to refuel a destroyer early in the war, you basically had to bring a destroyer about 40 to 50 feet alongside of you, sail at about 6 to 8 knots, and physically tie the ship to you. I mean, you literally was throwing a line out to physically attach the vessel. So you had to get very close, very slow. That works great in calm weather. It doesn't work great in the North Pacific in December of 1941. Later in the war, they come to this realization, it's like, hang on a second. If we sail a little faster, we get better control of our ship. So maybe instead of doing 5 to 6 knots, we go 8 to 10 knots, and maybe even 12 knots. And not only that, if we rig these falls a little bit different and so that we can get longer hoses out, the big fear was you can't put the hose into the water. If the hose dips in the water, it'll shear apart. If we put these bigger booms onto the underway replenishment vessels, and if we can do it with aircraft carriers and actually hook some wires over on the aircraft carrier, we can actually get more distance. And now all of a sudden you can extend the distance out between them. You can sail at a faster speed. You can start doing side by side, port and starboard side. And fundamentally you begin to change it. Now all of a sudden that one fleet oiler that's running around with a carrier task force can now refuel multiple vessels at the same time while the cruisers and carrier are refueling. And really all you need your fleet oiler to do is replenish your 3 heavy cruisers and your carrier. And then, the carrier and the cruisers can take care of the destroyers. And what becomes very clear is how to do the doctrine. The doctrine was the other element too. I'll give you the 2 examples I highlight a lot. Fletcher gets dinged for abandoning Guadalcanal on August 8th and 9th. He has to leave. Well, a lot of issues are focused on the amount of fighters he has. It's his fuel. I would argue it's always his fuel. He did not fully fuel up the task force beforehand, and that fell on Gormley and Callahan at SOPAC. They failed at coordinating that. And so he had to take the entire strike group, all of Task Force 61, the 3 carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, to go refuel, because you will not refuel with your oilers forward. He doesn't want to lose Neosho. He had already lost Neosho. They lost Netchez. They lost Pecos. They didn't want to lose another, especially a fast oiler. So all 3 carriers have to go back. Fast forward a couple of weeks, Eastern Solomons, well, learned a lesson from that. We'll stagger our carriers to go refuel. I'll send Wasp down to go refuel because SINCPAC tells me there's no Japanese carriers coming. Well, Eastern Solomons happens and he's short Wasp. And what you see is that evolves. And so that by the time you get to the Gilberts and the Marianas, you are surging groups of oilers forward. You can pull back a task group at a time, keep 3 of the 4 up forward all the time, refuel or send them off in pairs. I'll go hit Iwo Jima and Chichijima. The other 2 will stay back, and you can operate them to the point where eventually by the beginning of 1945, I'll take task group 30.8, my fast oilers, into the South China Sea. I'm going to risk them. I'm going to put them within range of enemy aircraft, because not only is it the fast oiler group, but they have protection. They got escort carriers. They got destroyers. I'm willing to risk them because I can forward deploy them more. And that means you don't have to pull back. Remember, Halsey's always bad at fueling. I have to say this. Halsey is terrible fuel management. He is just horrible. If you look at the Marcus Island raid, if you look at the Marshalls, he almost runs out of fuel both times. Even though he has a fast oiler with him, he sucks him dry. And they actually have to send oilers out to refuel him. He has to send off basically, an entire task group off of the Leyte because he can't support them. He has to send them back to Ulithi. He runs out of fuel. That's what kills 3 destroyers during Cobra. So there is a lesson learned that we can bring those fast replenishment vessels up closer because we're also pushing the commercial tankers up closer. We can move them up. There is a decision in September of 42. Nimitz sends word back to King, hey, when you send me commercial tankers, I want them rigged so that they can refuel underway. In other words, they can accept fueling rigs from the oilers so that they don't have to go in the port and go skin to skin, do a ship to ship transfer. They can do it at sea. So I don't even have to bring the fast oilers in anymore. I can actually meet them at sea. And so that evolution takes place. And what's interesting is if you look, one of the things that I've been studying recently is looking at the role of Task Force 15. It's task force you never hear of.
Mhm.
It is the task force that is basically coordinating the forward movement of cargo. And, what they're escorting underway replenishment ships from the West Coast over to initially Hawaii and then over to Noumea. And eventually they're doing it over to Inuitak, to Majuro. And what you see is this movement of commercial vessels, and it's a smooth transition. It's from commercial vessels, whether it's tankers and cargo ships, over to the Navy underway replenishment vessels, and they surge forward. Late in the war in 45, they have to change that a little bit. They actually have to push commercial vessels up even into the battle zone. And this is where you have, for example, 3 Victory ships that get hit off of Okinawa loaded with ammunition that go off in these catastrophic explosions. And they're commercial vessels. They have civilian crews on board, but that's because the demand for cargo is such that we don't have time for the transition to be done back at the staging bases. We got to do it at the front lines.
Yeah, I remember when I was doing my biography series on Admiral Spruance, there was a whole big deal that was made of, like you said, with bombardment, of we can replenish 5-inch ammunition easily enough, but if you want 14-inch ammunition, you have to go back to base. And then everyone was suddenly like, but what if we could transfer 14-inch shells at sea? And then there's a whole thing, like you said, about making pallets to make sure you don't bash one of them into something you don't want it bashed into. So in terms of human replenishment, I guess, how much of a difference do the advent of hospital ships make to the survivability of troops and sailors on the front lines? Because in 42, they've just got the USS Solace, which is great up until it needs to take passengers and patients back to medical facilities in New Zealand and Australia. But then by 43, 44, you're starting to see more of them come in. So do they make a big difference?
Oh, I think they make a huge difference. And you have to understand, too, that you've got a couple of fleets operating here, too. So we have obviously the Navy and the service force that's out there that is basically providing the support for the U.S. Navy. But then you have the Warshipping Administration, which is the commercial fleet, and they're moving cargo around basically to support both the Navy and the military in all their efforts. But then there's the Army Transportation Service. Let's not forget the Army has a Navy. As a matter of fact, many people will sit there and say, well, the Army's Navy was bigger in World War II than the Navy's. It depends on what you count as a ship versus the Army counts a lot of boats.
Yeah.
If you're gonna count all the lighterage and stuff, then the Navy outnumbers you. But the Army has hospital ships too. As a matter of fact, they're operating a huge array. And so there's a real question about what are the roles of hospital ships. So the Navy hospital ships were really geared to deal with the the wounds of Navy personnel and Marine Corps personnel. That's kind of where they were configured for. The Army sets up their own hospital ships to handle a lot of their transportation too. And so one of the things that became very critical is you needed hospital ships that can not just provide the medical support they needed, but you needed enough of them so that you can rotate them back and transport them back. You had to, once you filled up on a hospital ship with your patients, you had to leave the area. So you needed another hospital ship to come up. You were talking about the fact that you have Solace. Solace is great, but if you don't have any other thing than Solace, that's a big problem because you're going to have to transfer that wounded to a troop ship or a transport. And then they're going to have to go and hope they have the medical facilities on board that you need. And so they start converting a whole slew of these vessels into hospital ships. And so you get a vast fleet of them, including some purpose-built vessels for hospital ships later in the war. You started modifying some C4 troop ships. There's a whole slew of them that are modified. The Army converts some troop ships over into hospital ships, and you include more medical facilities on your normal troop ship. So, one of the big things is what's the difference between a transport and an attack transport. So, attack means it has the boats to do the landing, it has the lighters, it has the watercraft to do the assault. Troop ships and cargo ships don't have that. And so a troop ship, a true AP, not an APA, the attack transport, will have more medical facilities on board. But the hospital ships become really important because as casualties mount, especially in these forward areas, you need to be able to bring them back to facilities. So if you're with the hospital ships off Iwo Jima, for example, you have a slew of them there. They're going to shuttle back to Guam, get them ashore in Guam, or maybe take the transport all the way back to Pearl Harbor and basically be able to run. So very much like you're moving cargo, you're also moving the wounded. And what becomes very clear is because of the nature of the island assaults in the Central Pacific, you have these very brief periods of high casualties. So you need to be able to surge up. But as you get into more grueling combat in the Philippines, for example, you need to set up shore facilities and also be able to move those more critical patients back to the States for recuperation and repatriation. So it becomes very clear we need a more extensive fleet of vessels to do that. And you see the hospital fleets of both the Army and Navy increase accordingly.
Yeah, and you mentioned previously the lighters and the barges and so forth. Um, so, as the US Navy is obviously now moving forward to all these different forward bases as the advance takes the front lines further and further west and north, um, are there any particular advances in basing and logistics that allow for rapid reuse of material to prevent them sort of building these big permanent structures ashore and then going, oh well, we're not using this now because we're now 1,000 miles further north. Because I know by the end of the war they were getting really good at that to the point that when they handed over, I think it might have been it's either Manus or Majuro, it's one of the ones beginning with M, but they hand over that as a staging point for the British Pacific Fleet coming up out of Sydney because it's offline of what US logistics are at that point, and the British send some of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary up there, and it turns out the US actually has to send some Seabees back because they've been so efficient at stripping down and moving everything the US Navy had there. They're like, oh, we kind of almost left you with some bare beaches. We'll put some stuff back now. So what was kind of the major change between we're building mostly ashore to hey, we're just going to pack up and take this entire port to our next destination?
Well, I mean, it was Manus they were at in the Admiralties, which is it. And one of the things you see is, the military becomes really key, and this is based on commercial production too, of prefabrication. So oil tanks, for example, oil tanks are modular. You can basically throw them up, put them together, and when you don't need them anymore, you take them apart. I mean, we did that in World War One when we set up oil facilities in Brest for the Navy destroyers over there. We literally took apart tanks that were in Norfolk and just shipped them across and reassembled them over there. And the idea was, well, wait a minute, we could do this all the time. Just come up with a prefabricated kind of style, and we'll just pump these out, and you can build them. And the Seabees did that. I mean, they were really good at being able to throw those tanks up, get the piping system in, and really all the thing you have to do is take apart the tanks, and you can recycle them. The Quonset hut, the very famous kind of half moon kind of huts there, again, prefabrication. You can basically do that. Warehousing, the mats and the Martson mats on the airfields. I mean, you could pull them back up and reuse them and take them with you. And so one of the things that the Navy had developed prior to the Pacific War was the idea of these base units, these cubs and lions and acorns, they call them, which were different sizes that can be basically geared in there, and you can expand from an acorn to a cub to a lion, and you can establish these major bases. And so the Construction Engineer Corps, the CEC, was able to really develop how to kind of prefabricate and build these bases up, and so that again they can just follow the fleet almost and move up as they needed. You still establish some permanent shore facilities of ashore for them, because you do need them away from the area so that you can have assembly areas. One of the big ones they needed was for troop assembly. So if you're going to bring together entire divisions, you need to be able to get the troops off. You need to ensure combat loading is done in case you have to reload. So you needed that. You needed practice areas to do the exercises in. So you establish that. Guadalcanal becomes a massive base. And everybody talks about Guadalcanal from August 42 to February, but it becomes a massive logistics base. It's huge. It's absolutely insane in its scope because it can field all these troops. It's got the airfields there, just a lot to do. And so these bases become modular in many ways, much like we're doing modular ship construction. We're doing the same thing with base construction. And you can move it along. You can see that along the coast of New Guinea as the bases jump. The Army Air Corps is doing that. So in addition to the Seabees who are helping construct, you have the Army engineering battalions and brigades, which are massive. I mean, there's actually more Army engineers in the Pacific than Navy Seabees in the Pacific. And they're constructing bases. They're constructing all the facilities they need. And so they're doing that up the spine of New Guinea, heading into the Philippines. And so what we're seeing is a logistics capability that is mobile. You can set up the permanent bases. Again, nobody's exactly sure when they're going to run into opposition. They're not sure which route they're going to go. Go back to Trent Hohn's great book on command decisions by Nimitz. You don't know what base is going to be next, so you really don't want to build things specific for a base because you don't know if you're going to Truk, you don't know if you're going to Yap, you don't know if you're going to Palau. You're building all these kind of contingencies in. And then you've got to come up with very unique facilities too. So for example, one of the problems that they encounter is when they take the Marianas, Guam's got a port. Apra Port is right there, but it's a terrible harbor. It's really small. And when you start building the airfields at Saipan and Tinian, there's no port there. There's no facilities. There's nothing there. And so they got to be able to go over the beach with all the facilities, including the bomb loads for the B-29s, which is a big problem because they are literally at times during the B-29 campaign, literally offloading from ships directly to the planes. They're just catching up at points because of the infrastructure, the throughput problem they have. There's the famous comment about Gormley having 70, 80 ships in Nomia, and he can't clear the berths because he can't offload them because he doesn't have the warehousing ashore. So you got to have those warehousing abilities, because if you have 70, 80 ships eaten up being floating storehouses, they're not being efficient to move cargo around. And so there's always this weight. One of my favorite comments I ever read was a comment from the Navy ship director, the port director for the Pacific Fleet, arguing about sending ships down to MacArthur. He said, we might as well sink them because we're never going to see these ships again. Because once they go to MacArthur, they don't ever come back. And because MacArthur would hold them there, he would just not let them go. And that's, the other element too is really coordinating logistics, which is a really tough element that had to be worked out. We can talk about that a little bit more if you want in a minute. But anyway, I think, what you saw in Manus when the British arrive is key. I mean, as you start moving forward, you're kind of pulling back those facilities to recycle and reuse them because, again, it's finite. They're really pushing the envelope here of having the sufficient material to keep the flow going.
So I suppose that leads into sort of kind of a pick your favorite kind of thing. What are some of your favorite examples of service force accomplishments or heroics?
There's a couple, and one of the things that, again, looking at right now is how the service force was able to keep up the fuel for the fleet as they go across. And when you start looking at the numbers, it starts getting mind-boggling after a while. So give you an idea, at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was 11 oilers in the fleet. They had 11 oilers in the Pacific, and their entire capacity was about 750,000 barrels of fuel. A barrel is 42 gallons. You had 4.5 million barrels in the fuel farm at Pearl Harbor. And they were only allowed, the Pacific Fleet was only allowed to touch 500,000 barrels of that. 4 million were strategic. You couldn't touch them until the war happened. But what was interesting is within the first 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they went through 750,000 barrels of fuel. So they used basically all the fuel in the 11 ships that was there. They were consuming pre-war monthly 400,000 barrels. So in 9 days, they use almost double the monthly allowance they were using. And doesn't surprise me when you start thinking about, all right, the limiters are off, the fuel, we're not sailing at 14 knots anymore. We've got to be at high speeds all the time. And even with the diminished number of ships you have after Pearl Harbor, your fuel consumption goes up. So when you look at those numbers over time, when you go to like Coral Sea, for example, when SINCPAC puts together their plan for Coral Sea, you look at the logistics plan, they're talking about consuming 450,000 barrels of fuel a month with 4 task forces down there. That's Lexington and Yorktown and Enterprise and Hornet coming down, because they envision all 4 carriers being there to counter that. When you get to Guadalcanal, the invasion of Guadalcanal, you've got 3 carrier task forces, you got the North Carolina, and you got an amphibious group now with you. They're up to 850,000 barrels a month. You get to the invasion of the Gilberts, they're at 1.4 million barrels every 2 weeks they're consuming. And by the time you roll into January of 45, when Halsey takes Task Force 38 into the South China Sea, and Captain Paré brings Task Force 30.8, these are the logistics forces, into the South China Sea, he has with him somewhere in the range of about 3 to 4 million barrels of fuel on his oilers to keep it up. It is just a mind-boggling amount of fuel that they're bringing with them. When you look at the consumptions, the SINCPAC consumptions, they're consuming by the end of the war about 10 million barrels a month of fuel. It is an insane amount of fuel that they're just consuming. And you and I have looked at World War II for a long time. What defeats the Italian Navy more than anything else is it has no fuel. It does no fuel whatsoever. Same thing with the Japanese. Most people don't appreciate how problems the Japanese have with fuel. It's one of the reasons you don't send the combined fleet out against Guadalcanal, is because you're husbanding your fuel. When they send them out in June of 44, they're using almost all their fuel. When they send them out in October of 44, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel for fuel for the ships. The U.S. is literally awash in this. And it is just a ridiculous number. It's hard to get your head around. And then at the same time, they're bringing out all these supplies. I mean, the amount of food. I mean, you look at the crews, you look at the idea that, when Halsey takes over Task Force 30, or the Third Fleet from Spruance in August of 44, he takes that fleet out in September for almost a whole month. I mean, he's out at sea for the whole month. He's doing Peleliu. He's raiding up in the Bonins. He's over at Formosa. He's running around, comes back in for about a week. And then October, he's back out again. He fights the battle off of Formosa, which in itself is a major battle. And then he invades the Philippines. And the idea that these ships are out as long as they are, that they're running these gambits out there is crazy. If you look at the beginning of the war, they had it kind of figured out that a task force could sail about 2,500 miles from any set point. And, you can get an oiler with it, and that's about the limit. When Lexington raided Rabaul in February of 42, it doesn't do it. It has to pull back. It took 3 oilers. They had to string together 3 oilers to do it. By the end of the war, when again, Halsey's going in, he's got 30 oilers with him. He's got 30 oilers sailing with him. It's an insane number. Again, the logistician in me looks at that and it's like, holy cow, it's just a sea of oil they're running on. And then you get into all the other things, ammunition and food and fuel and food. And just that is all added to it. But the fuel for me is what does it. And of course, it's not just oil, by the way, Drac. It's aviation fuel. It's diesel fuel. You need those mixtures because you got to be able to provide it for the different ships. And it's just an amazing evolution. The coordination that's involved in it, I don't think gets appreciated because it's so seamless. We would just take it for granted.
Yeah, I'm just imagining is like when you put it that way, the sheer scale of the oiler fleet, you think to yourself, well, actually, think about something like the Battle of Leyte Gulf. forget about going after the landings. If you really wanted to be absolutely nitpicky about things, the best thing the Japanese could have done would be to try and capture the oiler fleet, because there's probably more oil in the oilers waiting offshore than there is in the Japanese home island reserves.
One of my favorite comments in the Gray Book, which is the
Hmm.
SINCPAC, the Pacific Fleet's running intelligence, when the Coral Sea happens, there's a comment about losing Lexington, but then there's a whole comment about losing the Osho. Like we can't lose fast oilers. It's like we have to husband these. It's like we can lose Lexington, and actually the reason everything worked out, I would argue, well at the Coral Sea is because they lost Lexington because Neosho was their last fuel,
Hmm.
and Lexington was such a fuel hog that it actually minimized the impact for that. But there's other ones too. I'll give you another one. One of my favorite comments that was ever done, I used it in my doctoral dissertation,
Hmm.
was a comment by Captain Roland Smoot. Smoot was a destroyer skipper at Leyte Gulf and very famous. I mean, a heroic guy, Smoot. He's just an amazing destroyer skipper. He's at Surigao Strait. I mean, he leads his destroyers in a fantastic torpedo attack that sinks Fuso and Yamashiro. It's classic. However, there is an interesting comment that he says he has to go and replenish his ammunition, and in Leyte Gulf is a series of commercial ships. These are, once I said again, you had to kind of push commercial ships up forward. And so here are these commercial ships loaded with ammunition. And Smoot, this is in Morrison's volume on Leyte. Smoot says, I encountered the most disagreeable lot of humans I ever have, and it's the crew of this ship. And he says, we came alongside and they wouldn't do anything. He goes, they wouldn't move cargo. Every time there was an air raid, they would stop doing everything. And he said it was horrible. And it created this very kind of poor image of the Navy versus the civilian crews. And I dug into this and I actually pulled the record on the civilian ship. This civilian ship didn't have any extra crew on board to move ammunition. So basically, the crew to operate the vessel was also the crew to offload and load the vessel. If you look at a Navy ammunition ship, it had a big crew. It had several hundred people on board. This is a commercial ship with maybe 50 people on board. And every time they had an air raid, they had to shut the hatches because of the amount of anti-aircraft fire that was flying in the sky. It would rain down on the ships. And what you didn't want was spent shells coming into an open hold where there's ammunition. So, you shut the hatches. You basically physically shut the hatches. So when you read Smoot's comment, it makes sense. Oh, these guys, they took lunch hour off. Well, yeah, because it's the only chance they had to eat. They didn't have the hatches open. Yeah, they just had an air raid. So yeah, the hatches are shut. But again, it shows the problem with keeping up the logistics. One of the problems the Navy has is they had to start prioritizing, where do I put my crews? As you start suffering more casualties on the forward combat units, you had to put more crews on those vessels. As you start increasing the anti-aircraft armament on the ships, it required more crews on them. And that put a bigger drain on the logistics fleet. Number one, if you put more crews on ships, you don't have the store space. I could throw a bunch more 20 millimeters. I can throw a couple of quad 40s on the stern, but now I need those crews. But I've got set space on the ship for food, for refrigerated food, for water, for everything. So I need to now increase my replenishment schedule because now maybe I'm not burning as much fuel, but I'm eating through more food. So I need more store ships coming up. And that means you got to shift Navy vessels off those logistic vessels to the combat vessels because 1944, you're starting to hit the manpower shortage in the United States. You're basically hitting the point where, okay, we got to make decisions. We know about this in the infantry divisions in Europe and that, but we're also seeing in the combat fleets for the U.S. Navy, especially as you're bringing more combatant vessels online. And so you're shifting more of these over to civilian vessels, and the civilian vessels don't have as large a crews on board, and that means you're slowing up your logistics a little bit. So again, I think it's peeling that onion a little bit back between those perceptions that there were, everything worked great in logistics to, okay, there were flaws in the system and sometimes they get overspelled. Again, I go back to Morrison talking about how logistics was done. If you watched how a ship was refueled in 1944 or 45, it's much different than 42 and it is much more efficient. You get those oilers with a carrier and battleship alongside. It is almost seamless. The other thing I would mention too is the casualties on the underway replenishment vessels because of the nature of the jobs they were doing. They suffered a lot of casualties because of broken gear, because of, a lot of these ships are imagine being sandwiched between an aircraft carrier and a battleship. Out in the Pacific, the waves are just washing over the deck. I mean, you're talking about a lot of accidents from just falling. I mean, I haven't done enough on it, Drac, to really be able to tell you how many crew members, but it's not unusual to read about crew members going over the side during underway replenishments, losing crew members and not being picked up again. It got to the point where they would start having destroyers trail underway replenishments because it wasn't unusual to lose a crew member. And if they didn't get sucked into the screws, to get picked up behind them.
Yeah, that's definitely a very much underrated portion of it. Because I mean, I remember, and it's admittedly it's a serving warship, but I remember reading up just the deck logs of the Pennsylvania in sort of the days before and after she gets torpedoed right at the end of the war, and that's a ship that is static. It is just sitting in harbor, but they're still getting 2 or 3 casualties through a day for all sorts of completely random reasons. There's one guy, I still haven't quite figured out what the heck he was doing, but he was trying to do something to an antenna in 2 levels higher than the bridge and wound up outside, and then rather predictably fell about 4 stories and fetched up. And they're like, yeah, this guy's got a couple of broken legs. He's not going to be going anywhere for very long. And that's a casualty rate on a battleship that is physically sitting in a harbor, not doing anything other than letting people be people. And then you're talking about a situation where you've got a replenishment ship, which, as you say, they're having to course correct to keep themselves between 2 ships. They've got the bow waves of those 2 ships hitting them. They've got the sea hitting them. They've got the ever-present potential of some random kamikaze showing up. And they've got all this heavy moving machinery around. Again, I think it's something people, unless you've worked in that kind of industry, that people probably don't appreciate. It's not the kind of case of, oh, someone let go of the garden hose. Oh, it whipped you across the legs. Oh, that's smarts, and we'll get back tomorrow. It's like if one of these unrep hoses like unclips itself or lets go or swings around and smacks you, at best, you're doing almost Looney Tunes cartoon style over the edge and into the water. At worst, that could be it immediately.
Oh, and it's you start looking at it, you're dealing with a hose that's pumping under pressure. So you got a 5-6 inch diameter fuel hose, which, by the way, if it ruptures and even if it's heavy oil, under that pressure, it's going to spray. So you have a fire hazard there. You've got lines that are holding everything under tension. They can snap. There's an event early in the war where Kaskaskia is actually taking the Yorktown group, the Samoa, in just before the raid on the Gilberts in February of 42, when she gets sucked into alongside of Yorktown. They actually crash into each other. They bump off each other. And so they smash the hoses. And so there's damage to it. Right after Pearl Harbor, the Indianapolis is alongside Neosho. Neosho comes out of Pearl Harbor. It's refueling Indianapolis, and there is a submarine sighting. And back at the time when you hooked into each other, you physically hooked into each other. You actually screwed the hose onto the ship. Today they have these quick connects so that you can basically just throw a couple of levers and you can detach automatically from it. That didn't exist at the time. When Neosho and Indianapolis pulled away from Neosho, she did it under speed. She severed the hoses, pulled the hose with her, and you break the entire rig, and now you got to re-rig it. You got to set it back up. It is a process. I'm always the photo I love the most is that of the Neosho refueling Yorktown in May of 42, where there's this chief bosun who's just like underwater on the deck, and it's just you see that, and it's like, how do these guys? And that's the South Pacific in May. Imagine doing that in the North Pacific in December. It's got to be miserable all the time.
Yeah, but on the other hand, there are some times when it's not quite so miserable because as you get towards the end of the war, they're like, well, we've got some spare capacity. Why don't we make an entire barge for the production of ice cream? So apart from the ice cream barges, which are kind of fairly famous, what do you think are some of the best examples as you get towards the end of the war of where the service force is going, well, we don't strictly need this to keep the ships on the front line, but we can do it anyway, and we think it's a cool thing to do, so we're going to do it.
Well, I'll give you one that they strictly did need, and it was because of an issue they came up with. They actually created 2 tankers that were water distilling ships. And so these two ships, they were known as AWs, were water distilling, and they were brought up forward into the anchorages because of the need for fresh water. One of the issues they had, especially operating in the Pacific, was their water use was through the roof. They were having a real big problem. We tend to forget that when you sail at high speeds, you don't just need fuel, you need fresh water. And, operating at higher speeds for longer periods of time puts a greater drain on your fresh water supply. And as you increase crew capacity, your fresh water supply is drained. Can't put salt water in the boilers. You can do that once, but not again. And so you need more fresh water. And the priority is the engines. The crew can go without water, but the ship cannot. And so you built these two distilling tankers, the Passig, and I forget what the second one's name is, but you built them and they can provide water directly to ships. So, when those ships would come back into Ulithi and other anchorages, that would be a long line. And matter of fact, on the underway replenishment oilers, they actually rigged a potable water line on those ships so that they can pump fresh water over to ships so that when they were underway, they can take that hose, hook it up, and dump it into their tanks so that they would have fresh water. I think we forget, operating in that environment, how much they were going through fresh water on a daily basis. It is a massive drain on them, and it causes a lot of problems. We have a lot of ships that will actually lose propulsion at times because they're running low on fresh water and have to do it. I think, the base force was really creative. I mean, you have some really interesting, Admiral Carter, who writes the book on this, Beans, Bullets, Black Oil, and you look at the commanders of the service squadrons, Admiral Calhoun, and who's overseeing service forces, and then the captains, Captain Perret and Alt, and all these guys are really coming up with everything they can to make life better for the sailors. So, for example, refrigeration barges. So they come up with refrigeration vessels to store beer in. One of my favorites they do was, because you couldn't drink on a U.S. Navy ship, so you never could drink on them. So one of the things they did at the anchorages was get people ashore so they can drink. Well, there was no refrigeration ashore because you needed massive power plants to do that. So they bring in refrigeration units, and these refrigeration units were mounted on trailers, and power units mounted on trailers so that you can power these refrigeration units, and they would nest them together, and so that you can at least have cold food, you can have cold beer. Bring it in. The ice cream barge was always the most famous one that they came up with so they could restock them on that. But beer was really the big one. That was the one that more than anything else, everybody wanted cold beers. And so they were able to do that. They also were able to make sure that mail was done. Mail was the other big priority, was setting up forward the mail distribution sites, because not only, any ship can go to anyone to refuel. However, getting the mail to a ship is very specific. And so they had a huge post office facility that was set up to ensure that they can get mail to the right ships. Carriers were easy because you always fly it out there, but it was the escort vessels in particular. And so there was a lot of effort done to establish that these groups are going to refuel these vessels to ensure that mail was done. And if mail wasn't done properly, they would at least get it to vessels that can feed it over to other vessels. There was a barge set up for movies, for example. So we don't think about this today because we live in a world of digital of movies where I could just download something and I get my latest episode of Drock off YouTube and I'm off to go. But film were very susceptible to temperature damage. If they got too heated, it would damage the cellulose. So they had to have cool climate environments for that. So they had film areas where they can do film distribution, get films out to the different vessels so that they could have movies on board, which was a huge event. Obviously, you set sail with maybe a few movies, have them on the ship and be able to see them. There's the great images in the aircraft carrier hangar bays of the movies, much smaller on smaller vessels. And so, as much as they could to ensure the delivery of goods, fresh food. So one of the vessels that comes in is called an AF, a refrigeration ship. Back in the day, the way you move fresh food was on fast ships where you sucked air down through the big cowlings and moved air through, and you kind of cooled it that way. Well, that's not needed. You can now have refrigeration units. So you can bring freezer ships out, refrigeration vessels out, and get fresh meat, fresh vegetables out to the ships as fast as you can. And so, it was those comforts that changed things. And when you listen to the sailors talk, they will always talk about the point when they run out of milk. They always talk about the point when they run out of fresh meat and fresh vegetables. And then they got to start going to the canned and the dehydrated. But, for a couple of weeks there, they're able to operate with fresh food. I mean, the idea that you're bringing milk, the closest cow to the U.S. fleet is in Hawaii. So the fact that you're getting fresh milk out to the fleet is just amazing. It's really, again, one of those incredible aspects they bring in. And that goes too to the shipyards. I really want to highlight the fact that if you look at the Navy shipyards, Pearl Harbor, Puget Sound, Mare Island, Long Beach, and all of them are pumping out barges and in these lighters all the time so that they can operate in these secure anchorages and store and move cargo around. I mean, if you think about it, you bring your task force in, do you have enough time to bring all your ships alongside the store ship that's there? That's going to take time. It's going to take you a week or two to do it. However, if the store ship arrives, it can offload part of its cargo into open lighters that doesn't need refrigeration. And now what happens is you can just move that open lighter with a load of cargo for a destroyer. And it's almost like containerization today, where we have containers. You use the lighter, that lighter comes alongside that destroyer. You can put a working party in, bring your stores, your dry stores up, all that material that's sitting there, bring it in. You can dump your garbage in there, get your garbage off. And, a batch of tugboats come out, collect all the barges, recycle them, reset them, and set them up for the next vessels to come in. There is a orchestra of movement that goes on in these anchorages and these fleet anchorages that we just don't even appreciate. Even with all the literature coming out on this right now, it doesn't go into the details on that base management, on how they're able to handle it. Because what we see is those, third fleet and fifth fleet come in for less amount of times each time they come in. They're in for a week. Well, they're in for 5 days. They're in for 2 days, and then they're cycling back out again.
Yeah, and I think it kind of underlines the point really, because when you look at, say, Kriegsmarine operations in Norway, and they're sitting there going, well, okay, if we save up all our fuel deliveries for the next 3 months, we can maybe make a short trip with Tirpitz and maybe some escorts out to, on a relatively short range mission into the Arctic. And if we save up for half a year, we might be able to send Scharnhorst with them. And then over in the Pacific, it's like, well, we lost one oiler. That's annoying. Bring up the next 7. And that oiler's probably got enough fuel to refuel everything that the Germans had in Norway, at least once over, if not twice. And then, like you said, with the food, it's like by the time you get to 45, you got a US sailor writing home, life is really hard, at the moment. We were only 2 weeks out of port and we're down to canned vegetables. It's really annoying. And then meanwhile, his opposite number aboard Nagato or something is just like, honored father, we're subsisting on a 50% ration of rice. I haven't seen a fish in the last month. Please send help. And it kind of underlines where the Axis and the Allies are at that stage in terms of just, if you can't keep your ships fueled and your men in food, it doesn't really matter at that stage what kind of wonder weapons you might come up with, because you're only going to have one and it's only going to go about 6 miles and they run out of fuel. Meanwhile, the US is sitting there going, well, I suppose we could send in another 4 destroyer squadrons if we wanted to.
Well, and I think that's the importance of the South Pacific campaign for the U.S. I think it is a massive learning campaign in logistics. If you look at Yorktown down in the South Pacific before Coral Sea, I think it's down there for like 71 or 72 days. I forget how long. And, they're on, dry stores. They literally run out of food and they're at that point. And so, I think it becomes clear, like, hey, we need to do something better. We need to figure this out. And then the disaster of logistics that happens early in the Guadalcanal campaign, the difficulty in surging cargo up to Vandegrift and the First Marines, the haphazard nature of that going on. I think everyone is sitting there and going, okay, we need to figure out how to do this better. And, Guadalcanal is the case. We tend to focus on the naval battles and the battle ashore for obvious reasons. But when you look at the logistics, it is really a test case because you get fleet logistics, you get shore logistics, you get repair facilities, you get of how to cycle aircraft in and out of the area, of what to do, where should your repair facilities be, where should your bases be? All those issues come in. And when you walk out of the end of the campaign in February of 43, you sit there and go, okay, I think we know what we need to do differently going forward. Here's the plan for doing it. Then you do the Gilbert's campaign. Not perfect, but you figure out a little bit more of it so that by the time you get to the Marshalls and Marianas, man, it is firing on all cylinders. And it only gets better as it goes. And the same time with MacArthur and the Southwest Pacific Offensive, same thing. They're figuring out how to do it. I think that's the most impressive thing to me about the U.S. Navy, and then when the British Pacific Fleet joins it, is their ability to range unchecked, basically without having to go to port at all. I mean, they could keep a forward presence off the coast of Japan indefinitely. They could rotate task forces. They can just maintain that presence all the time. And it was a chore. It's not easy. We take it for granted that it's easy, but in truth, there was a mechanics. And this is my one criticism I have with Carter's book on logistics in the Pacific. He tends to focus on it from the support bases to the fleet. He kind of misses, later in the war. He mentions it briefly, but oh yeah, and then there were these commercial ships bringing all this stuff forward because he's focused on that. But I think that's the element that's really important. The Navy districts, the infrastructure behind it are really flowing. And let's not forget too, we got to keep the commercial economies going. We got to keep the U.S. arsenal of democracy up. The British have got to keep the entire empire in check. We got to keep Australia supplied with fuel. We've got to get the population in India supplied. There's just a lot going on. It becomes very clear that World War II is a war of ships, and it's commercial ships, because the Japanese commercial fleet breaks down. They fail to be able to do their logistics. The Germans break down. The Italians break down. But the Allied fleet really remains going, and I think that's really and the British Royal Fleet Auxiliary picks it up very quickly. I would argue, yeah, you're right. It's a slapdash kind of group of ships that kind of follow them, but they very quickly become very seamless. There was a great story about when Task Force 44, the Australian task force, joins with Yorktown and Lexington for Coral Sea. They got to learn how to do unreps on the fly, and they do very quickly learn how to do an underway replenishment. And the Australians really become the ability. They actually kind of convey that notion over to the British Pacific Fleet when they come over about how to do these underway replenishments.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've probably in just about an hour or so, we kind of sped run through 3 and a bit years worth of, the possibly the single largest logistics effort on the planet thus far. But of course, there's a whole lot more to shipping and logistics, both in World War II and more generally, a lot of which is covered on your channel. So, where can people find that channel?
Well, you can follow me on YouTube at What's Going On with Shipping. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky under Mercogliano S. So my last name with an S to it. It makes my name Greek, but I'm Italian actually. But anyway, Mercoglianos. And of course, me doing my daily job here at Campbell University in beautiful North Carolina, being a professor.
Fair enough. So, if you want to follow on any of those things, obviously, I highly recommend the YouTube channel, because then, well, hopefully you'll see both our channels. And well, if you're heading over to, if you want to see either of us in person, well, there's the McMullen conference coming up in September, isn't there? And HINSA, and I know you're going to be at both. I'm going to be at HINSA, possibly also at McMullen, schedules depending. Now, of course, those are academic and history museum ship conferences, but you never know. There's a few guest spots and so forth available, I'm sure. And yeah, it's been a great pleasure once again to speak to you. I think the last time we spoke was in Annapolis.
It was at McMullen where and I meant to bring it with me today, but I have a very cherished heirloom, which is my Drakenfell challenge coin, which I'm very happy to. to have gotten then. But yeah, we had a great dinner up there. It was a great opportunity. Our first time we actually got to see each other face to face. And I want to thank you publicly again, Drac, for all the help you've done. One of the reasons I have a YouTube channel and my success is a lot of comments and answers and questions from Alex to me, and I appreciate that greatly. You've been great for me, and I appreciate it. And I got to say, you're one of my inspirations. I don't know how you do the level of work you do, but it is amazing to watch all the time.
Thank, thank you very much. It's yeah, well, it's amazing what you can accomplish when you actually like your job for a change.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. But yeah, so see you all next time, everybody who's watching. Thank you very much for watching. And yeah, whether you see me on Drakinifil or you see Sal on what's going on with shipping, I'm sure we'll see you in another video soon. Bye for now.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.